Hey, so a little bit of a different video today. I wanted to basically just have a sit down chat to talk about the news that Horizon Hunters Gathering, the co op multiplayer Horizon game from Guerrilla Games themselves, is being rebooted. You've probably heard that by now. If you haven't, that is the big news that the game is being rebooted after some playtests that happened earlier this year in February and May, and there were poor results from those playtests. So the game is undergoing some level of big overhaul or reboot, and they have a deadline by the end of the year to make a what sounds like a go no go decision on whether they're going to actually move forward with the game at all. There's good things about this. I think the fact that there is news of a reboot, which implies bigger changes, is a good thing. It shows that at least Guerrilla and Sony, on some level, are listening to player feedback, which is positive. And so I'm happy about that. But I'm still quite concerned, not just for the game, because I'm not sure that this is going to be enough time or a big enough change to really make a difference over the next 6 months. But I'm also really more concerned about how this impacts the Horizon franchise overall and the eventual release, hopefully, of Horizon 3. I do think Horizon 3 will release. I don't think there's much of a chance that it gets canceled, but unfortunately, I'm not like 100% on that anymore, which is insane for me to say as a massive Horizon fan. I would say I'm like 99 plus percent, something like that, that Horizon 3 goes forward and is what we expect it to be. But there's a chance there that something goes crazy because Sony's been making a lot of crazy decisions lately. So I want to get into all that. I also just wanted to say here at the top, I don't like being a pessimistic or negative person, and I really don't like contributing to like negative discourse on the internet, especially around my favorite franchise, Horizon. But I have had these concerns for a while, basically ever since I learned of the Horizon multiplayer game, Hunter's Gathering. And some of you know that I went to the studio in Amsterdam at Gorilla in September in 2025, and I'm still under an NDA on that, so I can't talk specifics about things I talked about with the developers and what I saw in the build of the game there. But it honestly doesn't really matter because you've all seen the reveal trailer now. Some of you have participated in the public invite only playtest that happened in February and May, and have seen the marketing materials about the game and all the discussion about the game. And frankly, there's not really much more I would tell you from the time that I was at the studio in Gorilla that would change what I'm going to talk about here in this video and what I have talked about in other videos already. So there's also some bigger stuff that ties into this, or some related stuff that ties into this, that I think people are going to find interesting. There's actually Shawn Layden himself has done a number of interviews that basically tell us the live service initiative at PlayStation started a little bit earlier, maybe quite a bit earlier than a lot of us realize. And I think that definitely has a influencing factor on Hunter's Gathering. And so I want to show you a clip about that and talk about that a little bit. And there's other related things that sort of underscore the point I was making about Sony and PlayStation just making really weird decisions lately over this whole generation, really. And so one of those things is the fact that Last of Us Online was actually not canceled for quite the reason that most people think. And we know that because there's an interview with the game director of The Last of Us Online telling us and explaining very clearly why that's the case, that it was actually canceled for different reasons than you might think. And it underscores why I am nervous about the Horizon franchise overall, because again, Sony just seems to be making very irresponsible decisions with their studios. So I think the best place for us to start here is to just go through Jason Schreier's article that he broke the news on this reboot for Hunter's Gathering. If you don't know, Jason Schreier is probably the best connected and the most reputable gaming journalist out there, at least for the types of games that you and I are really interested in. Open world, action adventure, RPG, single player stuff. He's connected to a lot of other stuff as well. Just to give you an example of how well connected Jason is, he recently had a one-on-one interview with Strauss Zelnick, who is the CEO of Take-Two, which is the publishing company that owns Rockstar making GTA 6. So he basically interviewed the person at the very top of the company that makes GTA 6, the GTA 6 boss, so to speak. Had a one-on-one interview with him, and Jason has pretty much always nailed it with any kind of reporting he's done on games. So You can take this to the bank. This is not just some rumor. This is not just another gaming headline. I'm very confident that when Jason says Hunter's Gathering is being rebooted, that it is being rebooted. So let's read through what he has to say here about it. Sony Group Corp's PlayStation division is overhauling Horizon Hunter's Gathering, the online action game it announced earlier this year, following negative player feedback, according to people familiar with the company's plans. So following negative player feedback is referring to the 2 playtests that happened in February and May. They were invite only, but they were publicly advertised. And some of you were in those. I was in those as well. Guerrilla Games, the Amsterdam-based PlayStation subsidiary behind the Horizon franchise, has been working to reboot the game since June, said the people speaking anonymously because they were not authorized to talk publicly about the project's future. So that's another interesting bit here, that they've been working to reboot the game since June. The last playtest was at the end of May. So that pretty clearly tells us that they looked at the results of the May playtest and very quickly made the decision, hey, this is not working out, and we need to make some bigger changes than what we made between February and May, between those 2 playtests. And I know in the official Hunter's Gathering Discord, there's some people that have been talking. They're kind of confused about, well, it seems like the feedback has been good. Why are they saying the feedback is negative? And you have to keep in mind, when playtests like this happen, they're not just looking at the discourse in their invite-only private Discord server, or they're not just looking at the comments from people who are excited about the game. That's a very biased and skewed small group, right? What they're looking at more so is telemetry data from the playtest, specifically things like how long do people actually log on for? And when they log on, do they just play for 45 minutes and go, this isn't for me, and then they log off for the rest of the playtest weekend and don't come back? And we're never going to know what that data is. They're not going to share it with us or tell us what exactly they looked at and saw, but that's the data they're looking at. And it's not the discourse within the Discord server or the chatter in the private channels on the Discord server about how the playtest is going. It's much more about the actual hard data of how well are people engaging with the game. And clearly it's showed them that is not good enough. So following poor feedback in private testing earlier this year, again, that's the 2 playtests, February and May, the plan is now to strip out the live service component and turn it into more of a traditional cooperative multiplayer game with a story mode and a far smaller scope. So this is an interesting statement. Obviously, I wish we had a lot more detail on what exactly that means. Does stripping out the live service component simply mean they're going to remove things like battle passes or cosmetic stores and basically leave everything else the same? If so, I think that's not nearly enough change. I think the game needs much bigger changes than that. But we will see. And we're not going to have clarification on this unless Guerrilla tells us themselves in some kind of statement. And turning it into more of a traditional cooperative multiplayer game with a story mode and a far smaller scope. They already had told us they were going to have a story mode, so I'm not sure what exactly is changing there. Maybe there's more of a focus on it. And I don't know exactly what they mean by traditional cooperative multiplayer. I guess they basically just mean removing the live service component. But yeah, would be great to have more detail on this, but we just don't at the moment. And so we can only really speculate. The game is not yet canceled, but the studio told staff in a meeting on Wednesday, so this week, very recently, that they will have through December to impress executives with their next milestone. Many of the developers on Horizon Hunter's Gathering will be reassigned to a different project that will also be evaluated at the end of the year. So 2 interesting bits here, right? They have through basically the rest of this year, and they started this reboot in June. So they've put themselves on a timeline of 6 months to get this into a place where they can impress Sony and I assume convince Sony that it's worth continuing development on this, and that it's somehow viable in the market. And then the other piece, that many developers on Hunter's Gathering, many of them, will be reassigned to a different project, and that project will also be evaluated at the end of the year. I think the most reasonable conclusion from that is the different project, right, is Horizon 3. What other project is Guerrilla working on? I've heard some people say that maybe this is they're moving people over to Steel Frontiers. That's possible. There is a small team we know from interviews with NCSoft and Guerrilla that there is a small team of people inside Guerrilla helping NCSoft with Steel Frontiers from like an advisory standpoint to make sure that it gels well with the franchise and the IP and everything. But NCSoft, again, Steel Frontiers is a totally separate multiplayer game. It's more of an MMO. And that's being developed by NCSoft in South Korea. It's not being developed by Guerrilla Games. There's a small team at Guerrilla giving input on it, but I don't see why that team would need a bunch more people. They said many developers from Horizon Hunters Gathering will be reassigned. I think it's safe to assume that that is Horizon 3. And then so this phrasing is slightly concerning, right? Why will Horizon 3 also be evaluated at the end of this year? Now, I think that's probably less scary in reality than it might sound. I think evaluating Horizon 3 at the end of this year most likely just means they need to kind of figure out what timeline they're on for development of the game and ultimate release of that game by the end of this year. Maybe Sony wants to see Horizon 3 moving out of concept prototyping, pre-production type stages at the end of this year and into more of a serious pre-production stage or a full production stage even, or at least have a plan to get there and start sketching out when they're going to get that game done. The rest of the article doesn't have a whole lot more to it here. So it's kind of just running through the whole live service failure of PlayStation. So my initial reaction to this is it's not surprising. I'm actually in some ways relieved, again, that it seems like Guerrilla and Sony are listening to player feedback and realizing that the direction they've been going with Hunter's Gathering is not it. It's not the right direction to succeed. But I'm also concerned, like I said, with the overall impact that this has on the franchise. The reception was very poor, even just from the reveal trailer. Very poor reception. All the conversation around Hunter's Gathering has not really been very positive, obviously. And so that's, a big, obviously, I'm not too surprised that they're doing this reboot. And you can tell from just the reveal trailer that it seems there's very little in the game that is Horizon. The characters are different, the art style is different, the gameplay is very different. It's very melee focused. There's only one character presented in that reveal trailer that has a bow. And everything else is basically melee weapons where it looks like you're just whacking machines with melee weapons. And it just doesn't seem to have a whole lot of Horizon DNA to it. And so it's strange that it is even a Horizon game in some ways. Clearly they were going for appealing to a different group than Horizon fans. I think that's really obvious. I think they would have made something much closer to Horizon if they wanted it to appeal to Horizon fans, at least the vast majority of us. And so what they've made, I think, is very much clearly a play to go after people who are in the Fortnite crowd, in the, the Overwatch crowd, things like this, these big live service games. And basically the point is I'm just afraid that, on one hand, that 6 months to try and take where they're at with this game and turn it into something that's going to be more viable and better is just simply not anywhere near enough time. I think they need to basically completely overhaul the game. And I would argue pretty much scrap it and start over with something very different, something much closer to Zero Dawn and Forbidden West. I think the art style is technically impressive because they have stated they were going for basically animated concept art. But the problem is most people, myself included, just don't like how it looks very much. And the problem is the immediate impression that everybody gets is like, why are they trying to make Horizon look like Fortnite? And if you put the two side by side, no, they don't, they're not the exact same art style, but that is the gut reaction that everyone has, and that matters. First impressions matter, and your art style is literally what people see instantly in marketing trailers and images and everything like that. So the art style has to change significantly. It has to, in order for this game to succeed. I think the characters also need to change significantly. Put aside what you might think about what they represent or whatever, or how you like individual characters. I'm not really concerned about that. I'm more concerned about the fact that they're not Horizon characters. I know they're trying to make them Horizon characters and introduce new characters into the franchise, but These characters that they have, this lineup of characters, none of them are existing characters. So Horizon fans have no connection to them. Why would we? We don't know who they are. We don't know their backstories. Um, could we get to know them? I suppose so, but it just is another hurdle to try to get Horizon fans on board. And it seems like a very strange decision when you have characters like Talana, Erend, Petra, Ykri from the Frozen Wilds, Katalo, Silence, maybe playing as Silence wouldn't make sense, but there's all these characters in the main series games that fans love, and it would be actually pretty excited to be able to play as in some kind of multiplayer installment. And I know people make the argument that, well, if you play as Talana or you play as Erend or you play as Katalo, how are they going to explain that in the main game later in Horizon 3, what these characters were up to? My response to that is, how are you going to explain these new characters in Horizon 3? How are you going to explain where they came from? How come we had never heard of them before? How come some of the characters have powers that even Aloy herself doesn't have, like energy shields and being able to zip through the air and fly through the air? I think that's actually a bigger problem to try to reconcile in Horizon 3 than having us play as Talana or Erend or Katalo or characters like that. I think trying to figure out how to integrate these new characters is a bigger problem, frankly. So I don't see that as an issue. Trying to use existing characters, and then most importantly, the characters and art style aside, those could change. But even if those change and the gameplay remains largely the same, it won't work. The gameplay in a game is the most important part of the game, right? And the gameplay is just, I've been given permission by Guerrilla to share my impressions of the 2 playtests that happened earlier this year in February and May. It's a little bit weird because you sign an NDA with the PlayStation beta program when you participate in playtests like this, and it's very clear in the NDA for the PlayStation beta program that you cannot talk about details of the playtest. So I'm going to tread somewhat lightly here and just tell you that the gameplay is not fun for what it is. It is nothing like Horizon. And it's not fun for what it is. It's not engaging. It feels pretty generic. It's very much just melee combos. Again, there's one character with a bow. Um, and most importantly, it's just not engaging. And so a game, again, the gameplay has to be really good. And it's very strange to me that they abandoned gameplay systems and mechanics that people were familiar with and really liked and were quite unique in the main series games in Zero Dawn and Forbidden West. I don't know why they abandoned that gameplay in favor of something much more generic, unfortunately. And I am very conscious of the fact that when I say that developers at Guerrilla put a lot of time and energy and effort into coming up with what they came up with. And they probably were at least somewhat influenced by requirements from Sony to do certain things. Um, and so I don't intend to be hurtful by saying that the gameplay is not fun, but it also needs to be said and stated very clearly. And um, it just isn't. It just isn't. It's not that engaging. And so I think the art style, the characters, and the gameplay all need major overhauls, like on the level of basically building a different game before some version of Horizon multiplayer could be successful. And I don't see how they're going to be able to do that in 6 months. And so this, I guess, kind of brings me to my point about my concerns about Horizon 3 and the franchise overall. Obviously, a very simple one is the fact that if they continue for another 6 months on this, even if they are moving a bunch of people over to work on Horizon 3, as I hope that is what the article means about having developers move to a different project, even if that's the case, this is 6 months more that distracts the studio, a portion of the studio, a significant portion of the studio, and it takes more money and it takes more time and it takes more creative energy to continue going down this path, even for another 6 months. And frankly, I think they could have very easily determined that this was the wrong path well before they revealed the game, probably a year or two ago, maybe even more. I think they could have easily determined that this was the wrong path to go down, but I think they're dealing with the sunk cost fallacy, right? The sunk cost fallacy is you've put a lot of time and energy and effort into something, and so you don't want to give up on it because it feels like it would be too big of a waste, when what you should really do is just stop. and that's the smarter decision. I think they've been dealing with that sunk cost fallacy for a long time now, for a few years on this at least, unfortunately. Um, and that somewhat shakes my confidence, unfortunately. I mean, it pains me to say that, but it shakes my confidence a bit in the team, in Sony mostly, and in what's going to happen with the franchise moving forward in Horizon 3. Again, Sony has made some really crazy decisions lately. I know everybody's upset about no discs, and believe me, I'm not happy about that either. No more discs starting in 2028, but and now we're certainly almost positively not going to get Horizon 3 on a disc, which sucks because I really wanted a whole set, right, of like collector's edition discs in steel cases or something, or a complete collector's edition that has all 3 discs. And that's just not going to happen now for Horizon, sadly. But the disc thing, they were always going to get to a point where they weren't going to do discs anymore. What's more startling to me are things like buying Bungie for $3.6 billion with a B dollars, $3.6 billion, buying Bungie and now putting Destiny on ice. Yeah, this whole live service initiative, Destiny was by far, after they bought Bungie, the most successful live service thing that they had in their portfolio. And for some boneheaded reason, Sony decided, you know what, let's focus on Marathon only and get rid of all these Bungie developers that have worked on Destiny for years and years and years. And we're going to focus on Marathon and we're going to put Destiny on ice. Now, I think in reality, someday they're going to come back to Destiny and do a Destiny classic, some kind of remake of Destiny 1 or eventually do a Destiny 3. I think it's too valuable an IP to completely put it on ice forever. But where they're at right now with Destiny and Bungie is insane after spending $3.6 billion. That's a crazy decision. Another example is Bluepoint. They gave Bluepoint a God of War live service, the studio that specializes in remasters and remakes of other games. They decided, you know what, we're going to have you guys do a God of War live service. And they had that studio, they had Bluepoint working on that for years. And now they've closed Bluepoint because it wasn't working out, as if it were Bluepoint's fault for that stupid decision. And The Last of Us Online, I'm going to show you a clip here because I think it really helps highlight this point that Sony's making really crazy decisions. You're going to see Vineet, the director of The Last of Us, explain how they were actually about 80% done with The Last of Us Online. And it was not canceled for quite the reason that we all have thought up to this point. So just take a look at this for a couple minutes.
In the next game, and I was there for 10 years in the end. And I went from being a designer to being a game director over those 10 years. So, and that was I could never have imagined that I would ever get to that point. But I've got Neil Druckmann to thank. Him and I got close. He saw the potential in me, and he kept on raising up my responsibility in the studio till eventually I was just one rung right below him. He was the president of the company. He started as an intern himself many years ago, and he became the president of the company, and I was right below him. I was a game director at the studio, and it was an amazing ride. And part of that experience was getting to direct my own game. So I got to direct my own game. I was working on The Last of Us multiplayer, so like a standalone Last of Us multiplayer game. And I've worked on that game for nearly 7 years. So I'd worked on it from 2017 to 2016 roughly to 2023.
6 or 7 years.
So what happened was during COVID,
let me just rewind.
2016 roughly to 2023. Unfortunately, the game got canceled. So what happened was during COVID, the game industry saw a huge growth because everyone was at home. So in 2020, money was flooding into the game industry because people are playing a lot more games all of a sudden because they're at home. What else did they have to do?
They had an excuse. They were told you can't do anything else.
Not just that, online games specifically saw a huge boost because people wanted to play with their friends. They couldn't see their friends, so they had to play online with their friends. So online games got a huge boon. So Sony, along with all the other, Sony is the owner of Naughty Dog. So Naughty Dog is a first-party company of Sony. Mm-hmm. So Sony decided to put a lot of money into online gaming, like everyone else was. And so that's part of why The Last of Us multiplayer got funding, and we got off the ground, and we made a lot of progress. And the game was doing really, really well internally. We developed it almost to 80% completion. It was very, very close to done. But then all the forces that pushed the game industry in 2020 were the reasons it started declining in 2022, 2023. So as people returned to the office, suddenly people didn't have as much time to play games. That spending reduced. The economy also went down. And so all that money that flooded into the game industry was not going to be able to sustain, because money was getting pulled out. They had to also kind of collapse the spending they'd spent. Like, they overspent, basically. They were overzealous. And so one of the casualties of that was this game I was directing. Basically, at one point, a decision had to be made. Okay, make this game or make the next game that Neil Druckmann was directing, the president of the company. And so kind of naturally, you can understand what happened there. They had to pick the game that was kind of the sole bread and butter of the studio, rather than this experimental game that I was working on that I believe was going to be really big, but unfortunately couldn't see the light of day. And that was a devastating moment for me. Because I spent.
So that is Vineet Aragwal. I apologize if I'm butchering his name, but the game director on The Last of Us Online, explaining that Sony gave them funding to scale up for The Last of Us Online. Sounds like that Naughty Dog actually kind of wanted to take it and like do that before the whole live service push, or close to the beginning of the live service push happening. And Sony said, hey, great, we want live service games. Here's a bunch of money, because money was cheap to borrow from banks basically at the beginning of COVID. Here's a bunch of money. Go make the game, do it in tandem to what we now know as Intergalactic, what Neil Druckmann was working on, getting started on. And they worked on it for all the way up to the point where they were about 80% done with the game, he said. 80% done after Sony funded it. And it was going well, according to what he felt. And then Sony said, hang on, we spent too much money here. We're going to have to claw this back. You guys need to decide, do you want to go forward with The Last of Us Online, or do you want to go forward with Intergalactic? It's only going to be one. We only have enough money to give you for continuing with one. And so they chose to go forward with Intergalactic. Now, the narrative that we've all been kind of passing around after the Naughty Dog announcement of The Last of Us Online being canceled was that they said they couldn't support both games at the same time. Now, that was true, but only because Sony decided to stop giving them enough money to do it, not because Naughty Dog themselves couldn't support both games. So that's what really happened with The Last of Us Online. That game could have been out by now, and it could have been a pretty good success. I mean, I would argue, out of all the live service projects, The Last of Us Online probably would have been one of the better ones to actually have a solid chance of succeeding. And basically, Sony just made an irresponsible financial decision and then canned it when it was 80% done. So that really, for me, underscored this whole point I'm making about Sony just being in a really weird spot right now and making really bad decisions right now for this generation. And that is part of why I'm concerned about Guerrilla, and I'm concerned about the Horizon franchise, because we all, assume, oh, Horizon 3, yeah, of course they're going to do Horizon 3. Of course it's going to be good. I'm not 100% on that anymore, sadly. I mean, I'm like high 90%, 95, 98, 99%, but I used to be 100% on that. That obviously they'd make Horizon 3 and obviously it would be great, but what if they gut Guerrilla because they've spent so much money on Hunter's Gathering, and now they have to spend another 300 million to get Horizon 3 done and I'm not going to bore you with the math, but you can look at, Jason Schreier has shared numbers for how much a developer costs per month, basically at a AAA studio like Guerrilla. And you can do some pretty simple math to show like they have easily spent at least $100 million on Hunter's Gathering already, and it's not done. If they're going to finish it out, it's going to take at least another year, if not longer, for them to finish that game if it continues to move forward. And by the time they're done, they will have spent easily, I think, $150 million if they haven't already. And so if they get to a point here at the end of the year where they've spent all this money on Horizon Hunter's Gathering and they decide, even after another 6 months, that they're just like, all right, we just need to can this, it's not going to work. How much appetite is Sony going to have for putting another $200 or $300 million into Horizon 3? Obviously, I think they're going to greenlight Horizon 3. I think, on some level, I'm like 99+% confident they will. But what if it's scoped down dramatically? What if it's a much smaller open world? What if it suffers in terms of quality because they lay off a bunch of people at Guerrilla because they don't think there's that much interest in Horizon anymore because Hunter's Gathering didn't work out? The crazier things have happened. They put Destiny on ice. They canceled The Last of Us multiplayer after they funded it to 80%. They closed Bluepoint after they gave them a God of War live service. They've just been making really weird decisions. And so it does make me concerned that they're going to make some weird decision with Guerrilla and Horizon. I want to show you another clip here. This is from Shawn Layden. I'll switch over to it here in a second. Shawn Layden, if you don't know, was the previous boss of the PlayStation first party studios. And he left in 2019, like about a year before the PS5 released. And I'm going to give you some key dates here to keep in mind when you listen to this clip from Shawn. He was the boss before Herman Hulst and Jim Ryan took over. Basically, Herman Hulst and Jim Ryan kind of like jointly took over Shawn's role after Shawn retired. And Jim Ryan obviously was above Herman Hulst until the last 2 years when Jim Ryan left. But what Shawn's going to explain here is basically that the live service push at Sony started during his time and before Jim Ryan and Herman Hulst were even in charge, and that it came from people above Jim Ryan, above him, above Herman. And the key dates to keep in mind here are Shawn left in 2019, Fortnite released in 2017, Overwatch released in 2016, and there were other big live service games happening around that time and really growing quickly. Destiny was big around that time, right? Of course. But also what happened around 2017 was Horizon Zero Dawn released. So just keep in mind, 2017, 2016, 18, 19, the late 2010s were when a lot of live service games were up and coming and blowing up. And it's also when Horizon Zero Dawn saw its release and a big success. But just listen to why Shawn decided to leave PlayStation.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your departure? It seemed like you were in your prime and then, you decided to depart. Could you tell me a little bit more about why you made that decision or how that came about?
Yeah, it was at the end of 2019, and I've been associated with the launch of at least 5 or 6 platforms for the company. If you include VR, you include the handheld platforms. We're coming into the run-up to launch PS5, and there's a certain exhausting song and dance that goes with every platform launch. Mm-hmm. We had just delivered our big PS4 games. I think Ghost of Tsushima was just around the corner to come out. And there were some other...
That game did okay.
Yeah, I think so. You could pet the fox.
Yeah.
And to be honest, the company was making some strategic decisions about where they wanted to take the platform in the future, with a heavy emphasis in games as service, live service gaming, subscription formulas, recurring revenue, whatnot. And that was kind of not my wheelhouse. I just make things like God of War and Spider-Man and Last of Us and Uncharted and Horizon. I didn't have the vision or the energy to try to, take it to this new area of live service gaming. So, all that considered, it seemed like a good time to step down after 32 years at Sony.
Yeah, it's a good run.
Yeah, I think.
So, again, what Shawn's explaining there is while he was still there in the last few years that he was there, which would have been right around Zero Dawn's release, right? 2017, 2018, 2019. That's when the live service push was being communicated to him, that they wanted him to do that. And there's other interviews, I'll link some of them below, but where he basically explains like he doesn't feel that live service games are really, he's not a fan of them. And he wasn't a fan of that plan. He wanted to keep making the single player narrative, story-driven games that we all really like. And that was part of the reason he left, is because he was being pressured from above to push this live service thing forward. And so he left, and then Jim Ryan and Herman Hulst took his place. But the point is, the live service initiative didn't come from Shawn. It didn't come from Jim Ryan. It didn't come from Herman Hulst. It came from above them, like the top levels of Sony corporate leadership. And I'm sure it was because they saw the success of things like Fortnite and Overwatch, and they wanted a slice of that pie. Shawn explains as much later in this interview and in other interviews. And I think keep in mind the timing. Zero Dawn released in 2017 and saw big success. These other big live service games were very successful around the same time. Sony got this idea in their heads at the very highest levels of Sony that they wanted a slice of that pie. And I think Guerrilla, as we know, because they've shared in like GDC conference presentations and elsewhere, that even back in 2011, 2012, 2013, when they were just at the beginning stages of developing Zero Dawn, way before Fortnite, way before Overwatch, way before the live service push, Guerrilla wanted a co-op multiplayer something in Horizon, and they just decided it wasn't going to work out for Zero Dawn, and so they put it on the back burner and they put that idea to the side. But then when Zero Dawn was so successful after its launch, in the context of what was going on in the wider games industry, I think there was probably a, hey, this is probably a good time for us to bring up wanting to do some kind of multiplayer co-op version of Horizon. And Sony probably said, hey, didn't you guys wanted to do some kind of multiplayer of this, didn't you? We want to do multiplayer stuff now. So yeah, we'll give you money for that, but we want it to be for the Fortnite crowd. Clearly that's who goes for this stuff. We want it to be for the Overwatch people. Clearly that's who goes for this stuff. And so I think we're never going to have official confirmation of this, I don't think. But I think what happened is Guerrilla themselves, if left to their own devices and left to execute on their own creative vision, would have made a Horizon multiplayer game that was much more like Zero Dawn and Forbidden West, much closer to those games, which is, for those of us who are interested in some kind of co-op or multiplayer Horizon game, that's what we want. I think that's what Guerrilla probably originally intended. But early in the very earliest stages of making this game, Sony came in and basically had strings attached to the money that they gave Guerrilla for it and set them down the wrong path. And they've been going down the wrong path basically since just after Zero Dawn released and the development on what is now Hunter's Gathering began. And I guess that's really, going back to the sunk cost fallacy. I think everybody involved in this at Guerrilla and at Sony needs to understand that they just went way too far down the wrong path. And they're dealing with the sunk cost fallacy, and they have been for a while. And I understand that, you want to get something out of the time and money that you put into this thing, but the only way that Horizon multiplayer is going to work is if it appeals to Horizon fans first and foremost, and it has to be much, much, much more similar to Zero Dawn and Forbidden West. So, zooming out again, Horizon 3, the franchise. Do I think Horizon 3 is doomed? No. Of course not. I think in all likelihood that game's going to come out and it's going to be a solid game. And Horizon fans are going to like it, and it's going to be like Zero Dawn and Forbidden West. The problem is now our confidence has been shaken and our trust has been broken a little bit. Even me, as a massive Horizon fan who built a channel on Horizon, I'm not 100%. Like I said, I'm not 100% confident that, honestly, that they'll even greenlight Horizon 3. I'm like 99% plus that they will. But I'm a little bit less confident that it will be what we expect it to be. What if it's scoped down significantly, again, because of the budgetary constraints that they've already spent well over $100 million on Hunter's Gathering? They may get the wrong idea again, that like maybe people just aren't as interested in Horizon anymore, and we should scope this down and maybe make something smaller. And then even if that's not the case, even if everything goes forward the way that you would hope with Horizon 3, at a bare minimum, what's going to happen now, there's going to be a huge time gap. So people are going to be disengaged. Even fans of Horizon, they're going to be much more disengaged with the franchise by the time Horizon 3 rolls around. There's positives and negatives to that. When it rolls around, it'll be like finally, and they'll probably be hype because it's like been so long. But there'll also be skepticism, and there'll also be nitpicking, right? People are going to be like, okay, look, that whole Hunter's Gathering thing was a huge misstep. And honestly, people weren't particularly happy to see the Lego game and Call of the Mountain VR game before Horizon 3 as well. Now, those things were basically almost completely outsourced. I don't think it actually distracted Guerrilla that much. But the perception for basically all Horizon fans is that Forbidden West happened, and then we had all these things that just kept happening instead of Horizon 3, instead of the thing that all the Horizon fans actually wanted. And every time one of those things happened, Lego game, the VR game, and now big time with Hunter's Gathering, the confidence became more and more eroded. Um, and so now, I worry that Horizon 3 comes out, even if it's really, really good, that people are going to be hypercritical of it because of all of this history that has happened up to that point. And it may impact review scores, which will impact sales. It may impact what the player discourse is around launch, and people, again, being hypercritical of it and hypercritical of trailers at release. And so they've put themselves in a position that's precarious with the franchise, unfortunately. They've put themselves in a position where not only does Horizon 3 have to be good, it has to be great, and it has to be so great that it has to basically blow everybody's socks off. It has to impress everybody who has even a little bit of skepticism, and it has to win back a lot of Horizon fans. And it probably has to kind of shut up anybody who's critical of Horizon to be like, okay, that actually looks pretty freaking awesome. And that's a tall order from where they're at right now. And again, I really truly feel that the team at Guerrilla is capable of doing it, but it's Sony, Sony putting them down this path with Hunter's Gathering. I don't have confirmation that that's what happened, but it really seems that way. And what if they decide to pull a lot of funding or slash a lot of developers from Guerrilla, and then Guerrilla's in a position where they're struggling to make Horizon 3 what it needs to be? This is what I'm worried about with the franchise. This is what I'm worried that Horizon 3 is just going to suffer in some way because of these missteps that I mostly attribute to Sony, but I also think there needs to be some accountability held at Guerrilla for not pushing back enough. I'm a little bit worried that the leadership at Guerrilla has allowed themselves to be pushed around by Sony too much. And so I think a lesson that Guerrilla needs to take from this is they need to figure out a way to ensure they can execute on their own creative visions. They need to find a way to keep Sony from pushing them in the wrong direction. For example, how is it that Santa Monica was able to get away with not doing a God of War live service themselves and shove that off onto Bluepoint? Maybe they had no interest in doing it themselves, whereas Guerrilla had interest in doing some kind of Horizon multiplayer themselves. But I guess I'm getting a little bit off track there. But the point is, Guerrilla needs to figure out how they protect themselves from Sony, at least currently. I mean, hopefully the outlook and the leadership at Sony can change on some level here, whether it's people actually losing their positions and new people coming in. If I were Sony right now, man, I would be begging Shawn Layden to come back. If you want a refreshing just perspective with somebody who's got their head on straight with the whole games industry right now, check out some of the Shawn Layden interviews. Just search them up on YouTube, just like Shawn Layden interview. There's a ton of them. There's a ton of them from like the last year, and I'll link some of them below. But Shawn clearly has his head on straight with what should happen at PlayStation. And I'm sure at this point he's kind of, he's retired. He doesn't want to go back to doing all that. But I would be begging him to come back and just be like, Shawn, do whatever you think you need to do to get this back on track, or get him as like a consultant or something. But they're probably not going to do that, and hopefully they're going to learn their lesson and either change people, or people who are already there are going to change their outlook. And Sony's going to start making sensible decisions again in some way here. But I do fear that Horizon 3 is going to be impacted somehow, and the franchise overall is going to be impacted somehow. So I guess just to tie a bow on this, because I realize this has been a very long rant. What's next? Where do we go from here? What's the best case scenario? What's the most likely scenario? I guess let me do both. I think the best case scenario, what I would do is, frankly, a year or two ago, I would have put Horizon Hunter's Gathering on the back burner and said, we need to focus on Horizon 3. Obviously, that didn't happen. The next best thing would be is if tomorrow they came out and said, hey, we need more time to figure out Horizon multiplayer, or we're just putting it aside for now. We're not going to be doing anything with Horizon multiplayer. We're focused on Horizon 3 and getting that out to players as soon as possible. I don't think that's going to happen either, because they've now committed themselves, as Jason reported, to this 6-month timeline to the end of the year to basically, it sounds like, get to a go, no-go decision on Hunter's Gathering. It sounds like they're giving themselves June through the end of the year to try to rework something with this game and decide if they want to move forward. Like I mentioned before, I think the scale and magnitude and scope of what they need to change is so big that I don't know how they could do it in 6 months. Um, my optimistic take on that is maybe they don't actually have to build something that's completely playable and representative of the direction they would go in. Maybe they just, they can have some concept art to show what the change to the art style is going to be. They can have a plan to say, yeah, we're going to replace the players with Horizon or characters with Horizon characters, but not actually do it yet. But they're gonna have to change gameplay. I mean, they're gonna have to actually change how the gameplay systems work again. I think dramatically, it needs to be much closer to Zero Dawn and Forbidden West. They're gonna have to change those things, and even just that in 6 months seems like a tall order. Maybe they've got some old build of Hunter's Gathering or Horizon Co-op before they had a name for it that's more along the lines of hopefully what Guerrilla actually wanted to make. Again, I don't know if maybe Hunter's Gathering is what Guerrilla wanted to make. I find it hard to believe based on what we've even seen in little clips at, game developer conferences of what they were doing with Horizon Zero Dawn co-op very early on. I don't think Hunter's Gathering is the direction they ever envisioned for it exactly, but uh, maybe they've got some old build they can dredge up and get running and resurrect to just prove the concept. Maybe they can kit bash together like, hey, let's just take Forbidden West, copy paste a bunch of Aloys, 3 Aloys, and let players play with 3 Aloys with her full weapon kit and all the systems of Forbidden West and Zero Dawn, and just see if that's fun. Is it fun to have one player tying down a machine with a rope caster and another player applying elemental states with frost by hitting a chill water canister and making an elemental explosion, and then the third player is there to deal damage as soon as the frost is triggered? I think stuff like that sounds cool. It needs to be proven out, and maybe that's what they do over the next 6 months is like just hack together some kind of internal demo of doing that with 3 copies of Aloy or something, to see if it's fun. But will that be enough for Sony to greenlight moving forward? I don't know. And either way, regardless of what they do, I think it needs to be Horizon multiplayer is at least a very small side project that's being rescoped at the moment to basically be a totally different game from Hunter's Gathering. And the vast majority of the studio needs to be focused on Horizon 3. And they would do well to announce that that's their new plan as soon as possible. I think if they can reassure players that Horizon 3 is the main focus as soon as possible, and that they're putting Horizon multiplayer to the side, or they're just, not working on it right now, that would be the best thing that they could tell us. Personally, and I know I'll get a little bit of heat for this, personally, I don't think they should completely give up on Horizon multiplayer. I actually think that there's still a version of Horizon multiplayer that can succeed. I won't pull the poll up right now because I don't have it on hand, but I did a poll on my channel. You can go find it in the community posts. Over 60% of you responded and said, yeah, you would be interested in a Horizon co-op or multiplayer game if it were more like Zero Dawn and Forbidden West. So I think another takeaway here that could be a big mistake is that, Hunter's Gathering didn't work out. That means that no version of Horizon multiplayer can work. That's not true. I think a lot of Horizon fans would actually be interested in it, and I think it could actually reach beyond Horizon fans if they made the right kind of Horizon multiplayer game. But Hunter's Gathering is not even close to that. It's way off the mark. And maybe all Horizon co-op ends up being is some kind of co-op mode like Ghost of Tsushima Legends inside Horizon 3, which I'd be down for. That'd be cool. But I do think they could make a Horizon multiplayer standalone game, as long as it's closer to what Zero Dawn and Forbidden West are, that's successful. But right now they need to focus on Horizon 3. And anything that they do with Horizon multiplayer needs to come back after Horizon 3 is out the door. That's what I think they need to do. And maybe that is what they will come to 6 months from now when they try to figure out whether or not they're going forward with Horizon Hunter's Gathering in any form. But I do fear that another 6 months is just kind of a waste of time on this, because I think they already have the information they need. I think they've had the information they've needed for a long time now, at least a year or two, to make a decision on putting this to the side or canceling it, or like very, huge reboot, basically make a different game, and they need to focus on Horizon 3. And I'm worried about the impact, like I said, for the franchise and Horizon 3. So again, guys, I don't like being negative, especially about my favorite games, but I am concerned. I wish there was something that I could do, that we could do to change things here and get things going in the right direction. I want to do a video on the things that I think Horizon 3 needs to win players back and to succeed and to get the franchise back on the right track. So keep an eye out for that. Honestly, it's going to be a while before I get that done, because there's a lot of great games coming. And I think that's, a silver lining here, is that we have a lot of really good games coming up this fall and into all through 2027 that are going to be really fun for us to play while we wait for Sony and Guerrilla to figure out what the heck they're doing with Horizon. And hopefully they get on the right track. I'm going to link the Jason Schreier video here. So this is a video that basically ties into the article he wrote that we looked at earlier. It's a little bit more of a broader discussion about Sony's live service initiative debacle, but he does talk more about Horizon Hunters Gathering in there and Horizon overall that you may be interested in. I'll link the Shawn Layden and the neat interviews below about The Last of Us and Shawn's departure from PlayStation. So as always, thank you guys for watching. I'm really curious to hear what you guys think about all of this in the comments, and feel free to come join us on the Discord server to chat about it civilly. I don't want crazy stuff going on in the Discord server, but I welcome, thoughtful conversation. And in my next video, we will get back to something that's much more normal and more positive. All right. Hope you guys are doing well, and I'll see you soon.